Welcome to the Jones Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. Today's story is a heart-stirring reminder that no matter how tough the world gets, your truth and your heart can light the way forward. If this moves you, smash that like button, share the story with someone who needs inspiration, and subscribe to the Jones Life Stories with the notification bell on to join our community of storytellers. Let's dive into a journey of justice, love, and standing tall against prejudice. The sun hung low over Riverton, casting a warm golden glow across the quiet suburban town. Children's laughter echoed from the park, where swings creaked rhythmically and colorful kites danced in the soft breeze. Families strolled along tree-lined streets, their footsteps light, while neighbors exchanged warm smiles at the bustling farmers' market, baskets brimming with fresh produce. Riverton felt like a postcard come to life, a place where time slowed just enough for people to savor the simple moments. But beneath its serene surface, the town carried the same unspoken tensions as any other, tensions that could ignite in a heartbeat, as 17-year-old Jalen Carter was about to learn. Jalen walked down Main Street, his sneakers scuffing lightly against the pavement, hands stuffed in the pockets of his unzipped hoodie. Beneath it, a neatly pressed polo shirt hugged his frame, one he'd ironed himself that morning, knowing today was special. He wasn't blind to the glances a young black man in a hoodie could draw, the way certain eyes lingered, assumptions forming before he even spoke. His mother, Simone, had drilled it into him. Be careful, Jalen. Keep your head up, but don't give them a reason. He'd learned to navigate those looks, to push past the whispers, but today wasn't about them. Today was about Aaliyah, his little sister, who was turning 10 tomorrow. 4 months. Jalen had been saving every penny, working extra shifts at Parker's coffee house, where the scent of roasted beans clung to his clothes long after his shifts ended. Early mornings, late nights, cranky customers, he'd endured it all, tucking away tips and paychecks with one goal in mind, to buy Aaliyah the perfect birthday gift. He'd set his heart on a silver charm bracelet from Belmont Jewelers, Riverton's most upscale jewelry store. He'd passed its gleaming windows countless times, his breath fogging the glass as he pictured Aaliyah's wide, gap-toothed grin when she saw it. The bracelet wasn't just a gift, it was a promise, a symbol of everything he wanted to give her despite their family struggles. Their father had walked out years ago, leaving Simone to work long hours as Riverton's chief of police. Money was tight, and Jalen had seen his mother's tired eyes too many times. Aaliyah, though, was their light. Her laughter filled their small home, her drawings covered the fridge, her chatter a reminder of why they kept going. Jalen wanted her to have something beautiful, something that said you're worth it. As he approached Belmont Jewelers, the store's pristine glass facade reflected the bustling street behind him. He paused, adjusting his hoodie, smoothing his shirt, checking his reflection in the window. Just walk in, buy the bracelet, and leave, he told himself. His hand closed around his wallet, reassured by the weight of $237 in cash, meticulously saved over months. Taking a deep breath, he pulled open the heavy glass door, a soft chime announcing his arrival. Inside, Belmont Jewelers was a world apart from the coffee shop's chaos. Sleek glass display cases lined the walls, their velvet-lined shelves showcasing rows of gold and silver that sparkled under bright, almost blinding lights. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the warm, earthy aroma of coffee grounds. The customers, mostly older women in tailor dresses, their diamond rings catching the light, glanced at Jalen with curiosity, their eyes lingering just a moment too long before darting away. He ignored them, his focus locked on the bracelet he'd come for. A delicate silver chain with tiny charms, a star, a heart, a small butterfly, perfect for Aaliyah's wrist. Behind the counter stood Margaret Whitmore, a middle-aged woman with meticulously styled blonde hair and sharp, calculating eyes. Her neutral expression shifted the moment she saw Jalen. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening on the counter, her gaze narrowing with a scrutiny that felt like a physical weight. Jalen recognized it instantly, that silent, deafening question, "What are you doing here?" He'd felt it before, that invisible chain of suspicion that clung to him in places where people thought he didn't belong. At the mall, when security guards trailed him through stores. At school, when teachers questioned his answers before anyone else's. In the grocery store, when when cashiers watched his hands too closely. He'd learned to navigate it, to keep his head down and his voice steady, just as Simone had taught him. Speak clearly. Don't let them rattle you. But it never got easier. The way those looks made his skin prickle, his stomach knot. Jalen approached the counter, forcing a polite smile despite the tension coiling in his chest. "I'd like to see that one, please," he said, pointing to the bracelet in the display case. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of every lesson his mother had given him about surviving moments like this. Margaret didn't move. She folded her arms, tilting her head slightly, her eyes raking over him. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension, as if the idea of him buying anything in her store was absurd. "That one's quite expensive." Jalen's stomach tightened, but he kept his face neutral, refusing to let her see the anger flickering inside. He pulled out his wallet, showing the neatly folded cash he'd worked so hard to save. "I'm sure," he said firmly, holding her gaze. "I have the money right here." Margaret's eyes flicked to the cash, her lips curling slightly, as if the sight of it offended her. Her fingers twitched near the phone on the counter, her posture stiffening. "And where exactly did you get all that money?" she asked, her voice casual but sharp, the accusation slicing through the air like a blade. Jalen stiffened, his jaw clenching. The question wasn't new. He'd heard variations of it before, but it stung all the same. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, controlled, though his pulse quickened. "It's just a lot of cash for someone your age," she said, arching an eyebrow, her tone implying he couldn't possibly have earned it honestly. "Did you borrow it? Find it lying around?" The air grew heavier, the customer's whispers fading into a tense silence. Jalen inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm, to not give her the reaction she seemed to want. "I work at Parker's Coffee House," he said, enunciating each word, his voice steady despite the fire in his chest. "I saved up for this." Margaret hummed, a soft, disbelieving sound, her nails tapping rhythmically on the counter. "And you expect me to believe that?" she said, her eyes narrowing, as if she'd caught him in a lie. Jalen swallowed the anger rising in his throat, his hands curling into fists at his sides before he forced them to relax. "Yes," he said flatly, meeting her gaze without flinching. She let out a dry chuckle, humorless and cutting, as if she'd heard a ridiculous joke. "Well, I suppose I should be flattered you thought you could fool me," she said, flatly, meeting her gaze without flinching. She let out a dry chuckle, humorless and cutting, as if she'd heard a ridiculous joke. "Well, I suppose I should be flattered you thought you could fool me," she said, her voice laced with a smugness that made Jalen's skin crawl. "I've been working here a long time, kid. I know when something doesn't add up." Jalen's fists tightened again, his nails digging into his palms. This was supposed to be simple, a quick trip to buy a gift for his sister, a moment of joy in a world that often felt heavy. He hadn't come here to be humiliated, to be stripped of his dignity in front of strangers. "Can I just see the bracelet, please?" he asked, his patience fraying, his voice carrying a quiet edge. Margaret sighed dramatically, as if he were an inconvenience, but finally reached for the display case, pulling out a velvet tray and setting it on the counter with a deliberate slowness. "Be careful with it," she warned, her tone sharp, her eyes locked on his hands. "It's worth more than you probably make in a year." Jalen gritted his teeth, biting back the words he wanted to say. He reached for the bracelet, his fingers brushing the cool silver, feeling its delicate weight. It was perfect, exactly what he'd pictured for Aaliyah, the charms catching the light as they dangled. He imagined her face lighting up, her laughter filling their living room as she tried it on. For a moment, the tension in his chest eased, replaced by a flicker of pride. He'd done this. He'd worked for it, saved for it, made it happen. But as he turned the bracelet to admire the butterfly charm, his fingers fumbled, the smooth metal slipping from his grip. It clinked against the glass counter, bounced, and hit the tiled floor with a soft, echoing thud. Jalen's breath caught, his heart lurching as he bent to pick it up. Before he could move, Margaret let out a piercing shriek, her voice slicing through the store like a siren. "Oh my God, I knew it!" she shouted, her finger jabbing at him, her face twisted with outrage. "You were trying to pocket it, weren't you? Thought you'd get away with it right under my nose." Jalen froze, his eyes widening, his breath trapped in his chest. What? No, he started, but his words were drowned out by her venom. Don't lie to me, Margaret snapped, lunging for the phone, her fingers dialing frantically. Get the police here now, she barked into the receiver, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and triumph. We've got a thief. Young black male. Hoodie tried to steal from us. The room went silent, the air thick with judgment. Every head turned, every eye locked on Jalen. He could feel their stares drilling into him. A woman in a floral dress clutched her purse tighter. An older man in a suit shook his head. A younger couple whispered to each other, their phones already out. His mind screamed at him to say something, to defend himself, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Not here. Not now. Not with Margaret's words ringing in their ears, painting him as a criminal before he'd even had a chance to speak. Jalen stood rooted to the spot, his pulse hammering, his chest tight. He'd known this could happen. His mother's warnings echoed in his mind, the news stories he'd seen, the conversations at home about being careful. But knowing it could happen, and living it were worlds apart, his fingers twitched at his sides, every instinct urging him to run, to fight back against the blatant lies spilling from Margaret's lips. But he stayed still, forcing himself to breathe, because any sudden move, any raised voice, could make this worse, far worse. Margaret clutched the phone, her voice sharp and commanding as she spoke, her free hand gripping the counter as if she were the victim. Yes, right now. I need officers at Belmont Jewelers immediately. He's still here, trying to deny it, but I caught him red-handed. Her eyes flicked to Jalen, a smirk curling her lips, her satisfaction palpable. And hurry, she added, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He's getting aggressive. Jalen's fists clenched so tightly his knuckles ached. Aggressive? He hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything but stand there, trying to keep his composure while she tore him apart. She was crafting a narrative, one that fit the assumptions she'd made the moment he walked in, one that everyone in the room seemed ready to believe. The customers backed away, their postures shifting, their silence louder than any words. A woman pulled her purse closer, an older man muttered something under his breath, and the weight of their judgment pressed down on Jalen like a physical force. In the distance, the wail of sirens pierced the afternoon air, growing louder, closer, an eerie sound that sent a chill down his spine. His pulse hammered against his ribs, his breath shallow, his mind racing through the worst possible outcomes. He'd seen the headlines, Black teen arrested after altercation at store. He knew how these stories ended, how quickly they spiraled, how little his truth would matter in the face of Margaret's accusations. His mother's voice echoed again. Stay calm, Jalen. Don't give them a reason. But what did that mean when they'd already decided he was guilty? The store's glass doors swung open with a rush of air, and 2 uniformed police officers stormed in, their boots heavy on the tiled floor. The energy in the room crackled, conversations dying instantly, all attention on Jalen. The taller officer, Sergeant Blake, a burly man with graying hair, reached for his handcuffs immediately, his face void of hesitation. Sir, I need you to put your hands where I can see them, he said, his voice gruff, commanding that Jalen's breath caught, his fingers twitching at his sides, but he didn't move. Every muscle screamed to protect himself, to run, but he forced himself to stay still, his eyes locked on Blake's. I didn't do anything, he said, his voice steadier than he felt, though his heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. Margaret let out an exaggerated scoff, her voice cutting through the tension. Are you seriously going to stand there and argue? After I caught you? She gestured wildly toward the bracelet on the floor, her face flushed with indignation. The nerve of you people! Jalen flinched, the words you people hitting like a slap. His jaw tightened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface, but he kept it locked down. The second officer, Officer Doyle, younger and leaner, hesitated, his sharp eyes flicking between Jalen, Margaret, and the discarded bracelet. Unlike Blake, he wasn't moving in immediately, a flicker of doubt in his expression. But it didn't matter. Blake was already stepping closer, handcuffs at the ready, his posture unyielding. Son, I'm going to need you to step outside, Blake said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jalen's pulse roared in his ears, his breathing shallow. His mind raced through every possible outcome, each one ending with him in cuffs, in a squad car, in a headline that painted him as the villain. He knew how this played out, how quickly it could escalate. Margaret's smirk widened, her arms crossing tightly over her chest, her posture relaxed now, as if she'd already won. She thought she had him cornered, thought her story was airtight. Jalen exhaled sharply, forcing his voice to remain calm, though it carried a quiet strength. "Call my mother," he said, his eyes never leaving Blake's. Blake scoffed, shaking his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Kid, you can make your phone call at the station." "No," Jalen said, firmer now, his voice cutting through the store, steady and unshaken. "Call my mother now." Margaret rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, sure, let's call Mommy," she said, her tone mocking, as if the idea was laughable. "What's she going to do? Come down here and tell you to scream for justice?" She let out a dry, humorless laugh, her confidence unshaken. Jalen ignored her, his focus unwavering. He reached into his pocket. Not fast, not sudden, his movements deliberate, pulling out his phone. His hands were steady as he dialed, his eyes locked on the officer's. "Mom," he said when the line connected, his voice calm but urgent. "I need you at Belmont Jewelers. Now." The room felt suspended, the tension palpable. Margaret tapped her foot impatiently, her smirk faltering slightly as she sensed something shifting. Blake sighed, his grip on the handcuffs loosening just a fraction, though his posture remained rigid. Doyle checked his watch, his hesitation growing, his eyes darting between Jalen and the bracelet on the floor. The customers had backed away, some whispering, some pulling out their phones, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Minutes stretched like hours, the air thick with anticipation. Jalen stood still, his phone back in his pocket, his hands at his sides, his breathing controlled. He wasn't begging, wasn't pleading, just waiting, his composure a quiet defiance against the accusations hanging over him. Margaret's foot tapped faster, her fingers drumming on the counter, her confidence starting to crack. Blake shifted his weight, his jaw ticking with impatience. Doyle's gaze lingered on Jalen, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Then the glass doors swung open again, and a woman walked in, tall, commanding, her presence filling the room like a storm rolling in. Her navy blue suit hugged her frame, her heels clicked sharply against the tile, and her sharp eyes, so much like Jalen's, scanned the scene with a precision that left no room for doubt. She held up a badge, flashing it with an authority that silenced the room. "I'm Dr. Simone Carter," she announced, her voice cutting through the tension like steel. "Chief of Police for Riverton PD." She turned her gaze to Blake, her expression unreadable but deadly. "And this," she said, gesturing to Jalen, "is my son." The room went dead silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone like a physical force. Margaret's smirk vanished, her face paling, her eyes widening with a mix of shock and panic. Blake stiffened, his hand faltering on the cuffs, his dominance crumbling. Doyle exhaled sharply, his posture shifting as he recalculated, his doubt now solidified. The customers froze, their whispers dying, their phones lowering as the reality of the moment sank in. Simone's eyes locked onto Blake, piercing and unwavering. "Sergeant," she said, her voice even, but carrying a dangerous undercurrent, "I assume you have a reasonable explanation for why my son is standing here, surrounded, while you reach for your handcuffs without asking him a single question." Blake shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tense, his hands slowly lowering, though he didn't release the cuffs entirely. "Ma'am, we received a call reporting an attempted theft," he said, his voice clipped, defensive. "We responded accordingly." Simone tilted her head, her eyes narrowing, her presence commanding every inch of the room. "Accordingly," she said coolly, her tone slicing through his words. "You mean walking in here, seeing a young black man, and immediately deciding he was guilty?" Blake bristled, his face reddening slightly. "That's not what happened," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Really?" Simone said, her voice deadly calm, her gaze unrelenting. "Because it looks a whole lot like that to me." Margaret found her voice, her tone sharp with desperation, as if scrambling to regain control. I called because he tried to steal from me, she blurted, pointing at Jalen, her voice rising in pitch. He dropped the bracelet and was clearly about to take it. I stopped him just in time, and I did what any responsible citizen would do. I called the police before he could run off with my merchandise. Simone exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting to Jalen for the first time since she'd arrived. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't pleaded, just stood there, his anger simmering beneath a carefully composed surface, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet strength. She saw it all, the exhaustion, the frustration, the weight of a world that judged him before he could speak. Her jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady as she turned back to Blake. "Did you check the security footage?" Blake hesitated, his eyes flicking to Margaret, then back to Simone. "We were just about to," he said, his voice tight. "No, you weren't," Simone cut in, her tone smooth but deadly, her words landing like a whip. "You were about to arrest him without reviewing any evidence, without questioning him, without doing your job." Doyle swallowed hard, his gaze darting between his superior and Simone, his hesitation now tangible. "We should check the footage," he said cautiously, his voice low but firm, a subtle challenge to Blake's authority. Blake's eyes snapped to Doyle, a flash of betrayal in his expression, but he couldn't argue. Not now, not with Simone standing there, her badge gleaming, her authority undeniable. He exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw tightening. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely concealing his frustration. Margaret's face twisted, her voice rising in disbelief. "What?" "No. I told you what happened," she shouted, gesturing wildly at Jalen, her composure unraveling. "You saw how he acted. This is ridiculous. You're seriously going to listen to her?" Simone finally turned her full attention to Margaret, and the weight of her gaze alone silenced the older woman. Margaret's defiance shrank, her shoulders hunching slightly, as if she suddenly realized the power she thought she held was slipping away. "Mrs. Whitmore," Simone said, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut steel, "let me make something very, very clear to you." She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her heels clicking, her words deliberate and heavy. "You're standing in front of a boy who walked into your store to buy a bracelet for his sister, a boy who saved his own hard-earned money to support your business, a boy who you immediately labeled a thief because you decided, before he even spoke, that he didn't belong here." She let the words hang, let them sink in, let them wrap around Margaret's throat like a tightening noose. "So I hope for your sake that security footage tells the story you claim it does. Because if it doesn't," her lips pressed into a thin, deadly line, "you will answer for every word you just said." Margaret swallowed thickly, her bravado cracking, her eyes darting to the officers, then to the customers, searching for an ally and finding none. Blake cleared his throat, shifting. Uncomfortably, his authority diminished. "Let's check the cameras," he said, his voice tight, gesturing to the store manager, who had been standing frozen in the background, too stunned to intervene. The manager, a nervous man in an ill-fitting suit, hurried to the back, his hands trembling as he retrieved the footage. The small screen behind the counter flickered to life, the silent recording playing for all to see. It showed Jalen entering the store, his posture relaxed but purposeful. It showed him speaking to Margaret, his voice calm, his wallet out, the cash visible. It showed the bracelet slipping from his fingers, hitting the counter, falling to the floor. No theft, no pocketing, no crime. Just a 17-year-old boy trying to buy a gift for his sister. The silence that followed was suffocating. Doyle sighed, rubbing a hand down his face, his shoulders slumping. Blake looked as though he'd swallowed something bitter, his jaw ticking with restrained frustration. Margaret's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing, her hands trembling as the reality crashed down. The customers shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others staring at Margaret with a mix of shock and disdain. Simone inhaled deeply, her voice dangerously soft as she spoke again. "So, Sergeant," she said, her eyes locked on Blake, "what happens now? Do you still want to arrest my son?" Blake said nothing, his jaw clenched, his hands empty now, the cuffs back on his belt. Simone turned to Margaret, her expression unreadable, her voice carrying a quiet menace. "And you," she continued, tilting her head slightly, Are you going to tell me what exactly you were so certain of? Margaret's lips trembled, her eyes darting around the room, her voice faltering. I thought, she stammered, but no defense came, no justification, just the crushing realization that she played her hand too confidently, too recklessly, and lost. Simone gave a slow, knowing nod, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile, not one of triumph but of certainty. That's what I thought, she said, her words final. Blake cleared his throat, straightening his shoulders, his voice tight with strained professionalism. Ma'am, he addressed Simone, avoiding her gaze. I think we're done here. Simone arched a brow, her voice deceptively mild. No apology. Blake's jaw clenched tighter, his silence his only response. Margaret opened her mouth, searching for words, for some way to salvage the situation, but nothing came. Her hands twisted together, her face a mask of panic and shame. Simone exhaled, turning to Jalen, her expression softening for the first time. Come on, baby, she murmured, her voice low, meant only for him. We're leaving. Jalen didn't move at first, his eyes locked on Margaret, then Blake, then the bracelet still lying on the floor, its charms glinting under the lights. He wanted to feel relief, to feel justice, to feel something other than the exhaustion that settled deep in his bones. He'd won this battle, but the war, the one he fought every day just by existing in a world that judged him, was far from over. He met Margaret's gaze one last time, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of everything he'd endured. All I wanted was to buy a bracelet, he said, his words simple but heavy. But I guess I got something more valuable instead. With that, he turned, his head high, his back straight, and followed his mother out the door, leaving Margaret frozen, her world crumbling behind her. As they stepped outside, the crisp afternoon air hit Jalen's face, but it did little to ease the tightness in his chest. The tension from the store clung to him, a heavy, invisible weight. Simone walked beside him, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, her fury radiating in waves though her face remained composed. They reached her car, parked a short distance away, and she turned to him, her expression unreadable, her eyes searching his. Are you okay? She asked, her voice measured, but beneath it was a depth of concern, a mother's worry that no badge could mask. Jalen glanced back at the store, his eyes catching the faint outline of Margaret through the window, still standing behind the counter, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge as if to steady herself. Blake was stiff, his posture rigid, while Doyle looked somewhere between relieved and ashamed. The customers had returned to browsing, as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't stood by while a boy was accused of a crime he didn't commit. I don't know, Jalen admitted, dragging a hand down his face, his voice rough. I should feel better, like I proved something. Like I won. But I shouldn't have had to prove anything in the first place. Simone studied him, her features softening, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Baby, she said, her voice quieter now, you shouldn't have had to. None of this should have happened. They stood there, the weight of her words settling between them, the world moving on around them, cars passing, people walking, the sky still that same indifferent blue. Jalen's hands curled into fists, his fingers aching from how tightly he'd clenched them inside the store. It's not fair, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I did everything right. I worked for that money. I was polite. I didn't raise my voice. And it still wasn't enough. Simone's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and pain, but she kept her voice steady. It's not fair, she agreed, and it's not right. But you stood tall in there, Jalen. You didn't let her break you. You didn't let any of them break you. Jalen let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Didn't I? I stood there while she talked about me like I was nothing, while everyone just watched, believing her. And even when she was wrong, she couldn't say it. She couldn't even look at me. Before Simone could respond, the store door swung open again, and Jalen's eyes flicked up, his body tensing instinctively. Margaret stepped outside, her purse clutched tightly, her knuckles white. She looked different now, smaller, stripped of the confidence she'd wielded so effortlessly inside. Her face was stiff, her lips pressed together, her eyes darting to Jalen, then to Simone, then to the ground. She hesitated, her throat bobbing as if she were waging an internal war, as if she had something to say but couldn't find the words. Jalen's heartbeat drummed in his ears, his breath shallow as he waited. Would she apologize? Would she admit she'd been wrong, that she judged him before he'd even spoken? Margaret took a step forward, then another, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. She opened her mouth, closed it, then shook her head, her expression shifting into something pathetic, a wounded pride that refused to bend. She started, her voice faltering, but no words followed. No apology, no accountability. Just a silent retreat as she turned and walked away, her pace quick, as if she could outrun the consequences of her actions. Jalen let out a sharp, humorless laugh, the sound raw and hollow. "Figures," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. Simone scoffed, folding her arms, her gaze following Margaret's retreating figure. "Cowards never know how to say they're sorry," she said, her tone laced with disgust. Jalen watched as Margaret disappeared down the sidewalk, her posture stiff, her steps hurried. He should have expected it. People like her rarely face their mistakes, rarely acknowledge the harm they caused. But it still stung, the way she'd walked away without so much as a glance back, as if he were nothing more than a momentary inconvenience. Blake and Doyle exited the store next, Doyle glancing at them briefly before looking away, his jaw tight, his hands flexing at his sides, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Blake, on the other hand, barely acknowledged them, offering only a stiff nod in Simone's direction before stalking to his squad car, his pride bruised but intact. Jalen exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice quiet, the weight of the moment settling over him. Simone glanced at him, her eyes sharp, resolute. "For now," she said, her tone carrying a promise of more to come. Jalen turned away from the store, his gaze drifting to the street, where life continued as if nothing had happened. A family walked by, laughing, a child clutching a balloon. A car pulled into a parking spot, its radio playing faintly. The world didn't stop for what had happened inside Belmont Jewelers, didn't pause to acknowledge the injustice Jalen had faced. He clenched his jaw, then shook his head, the exhaustion seeping deeper into his bones. Simone reached out, squeezing his shoulder gently, her touch grounding him. "Come on," she said, her voice softer now. "Let's go home." Jalen nodded, following her to the car, the bracelet, and the moment it represented, left behind on the store floor. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like enough. It never did. Inside the car, the hum of the engine filled the silence as Simone gripped the steering wheel, her nails pressing faint crescents into the leather. Jalen leaned back in the seat, his eyes fixed on the dashboard, his fingers drumming lightly against his jeans. The weight of everything that had happened settled deep in his chest, threading through his muscles, a mix of anger, exhaustion, and something he couldn't quite name. Outside, Riverton moved on. People walked, cars passed, the sky remained that same indifferent blue, but inside, the air was heavy, charged with unspoken words. Simone broke the silence, her voice softer now, lacking the sharp authority she'd wielded in the store. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, her eyes flicking to him, a mother's concern shining through her chief's armor. Jalen stared at the dashboard, his fingers stilling. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. "I feel angry, tired, like none of this really matters because tomorrow it'll be someone else in my place and no one's going to stop to ask if they're okay." Simone inhaled deeply, her hands tightening on the wheel before she forced them to relax. "I know," she murmured, her voice heavy with the weight of a truth she'd lived too long. "It's a cycle, Jalen. It keeps repeating, over and over. But today we fought back. Today, you didn't let them break you." Jalen let out another bitter laugh, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "Didn't I? I stood there, listening to her talk about me like I was nothing, while everyone else just let it happen. And even when she got caught, even when she knew she was wrong, she still couldn't say the words." He turned to Simone, his voice cracking with frustration. "How do you fight back against that? How do you make people see you as a person when they've already decided you're not?" Simone didn't answer right away. She stared straight ahead, her lips pressed together, her eyes distant, as if replaying her own battles, her own moments of being judged. dismissed, reduced. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but unshakable, each word deliberate. "You fight back by refusing to let them define you," she said. "By making sure that no matter what they see when they look at you, you know who you are. By showing them, over and over again, that they're wrong, even when they refuse to admit it. It's not easy, and it's not fair, but it's the only way." Jalen clenched his jaw, looking out the window, the world blurring slightly as he blinked back the sting in his eyes. It wasn't enough. It never felt like enough, but maybe it was all they had. The silence stretched between them, heavier now, more settled, a shared understanding that didn't need words. Then Simone reached into her purse, pulling out her phone. Jalen frowned, his brow furrowing as she scrolled through her contacts, her expression unreadable. "Who are you calling?" he asked, wary. She didn't answer immediately, just waited as the line rang, her fingers tapping lightly against the wheel. "Cynthia," she said when the call connected, her voice shifting back to that of the chief, sharp and authoritative. "I need a press release prepared immediately." "Yes, regarding Belmont Jewelers. I want a full investigation into the call that was made to dispatch, an internal review on Sergeant Blake, and a public statement on racial profiling and misuse of emergency services. Make sure the media knows exactly what happened today." Jalen's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise cutting through his exhaustion. "You're really going after them," he said, his voice low, almost disbelieving. Simone lowered the phone slightly, giving him a knowing look, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You think I was just going to let this go?" she said, her tone carrying a quiet fierceness. Jalen exhaled, a mix of relief and disbelief settling in his chest. He'd spent so long watching stories like this unfold the same way. Someone profiled, humiliated, accused, and then, even when the truth came out, nothing changed. The world moved on, the accusers walked away, and the victims were left to carry the weight alone. But this felt different. This felt like a fight that wouldn't end when they drove away from the store. Simone returned to her call, her voice firm. "And Cynthia, make sure Margaret Whitmore's name is included in the statement." If she thought she could do this without consequences, she was mistaken. Jalen let out a slow breath, glancing down at his hands, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. Maybe justice wasn't always immediate. Maybe it didn't come with an apology or a neat resolution, but sometimes it looked like accountability, like a mother refusing to let the world forget what had happened. And this time, he wasn't carrying the weight alone. 3 days later, Belmont Jewelers was everywhere. News stations ran segments on the incident, their anchors dissecting the security footage that had gone viral online. Social media erupted with hashtags, #JusticeForJalen, #EndRacial Profiling, trending across platforms. The store's Yelp page was flooded with one-star reviews, customers vowing never to shop there again. Margaret Whitmore had been placed on indefinite leave, though whispers in Riverton suggested she'd been quietly fired, her name now synonymous with the incident. An official statement from the Riverton PD condemned racial profiling, and an internal investigation into Sergeant Blake was launched after body cam footage revealed how quickly he'd moved to detain Jalen without evidence. Jalen sat on the couch in their living room, scrolling through the news articles on his phone, the words blurring together. He should have felt victorious, should have felt like he'd won something, but instead, his thoughts kept circling back to how easily it could have gone another way. If his mother hadn't been the chief of police, if Doyle hadn't hesitated, if there hadn't been cameras, where would he be? Would he be in a cell? Would his name be in the headlines for a different reason? The questions gnawed at him, a quiet fear he couldn't shake. His thoughts were interrupted by a high-pitched squeal. "Jalen! Jalen, look what Mom got me!" Aaliyah launched onto the couch beside him, her wrist extended proudly, the silver charm bracelet gleaming under the living room light. The tiny charms, a star, a heart, a butterfly, dangled as she waved her hand excitedly, her gap-toothed grin lighting up the room. Jalen's chest tightened, a mix of relief and guilt washing over him. Simone had clearly bought the bracelet, ensuring Aaliyah got her birthday gift despite everything, because Jalen hadn't been. Able to face returning to that store, to that moment. "You like it?" he asked, his voice soft, a smile tugging at his lips despite the weight in his heart. "Are you kidding?" "It's perfect," Aaliyah said, her eyes sparkling. She tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly. "But I thought you were going to get it." Jalen hesitated, his smile faltering for a moment. The memory of the store, of Margaret's accusations, of the sirens, flashed through his mind, but he pushed it away. "I picked it out," he said finally, his voice steady, his smile returning. "That's what matters, right?" Aaliyah beamed, nodding enthusiastically. "Right." She flung her arms around him in a quick, tight hug, her bracelet jingling softly, then dashed off to show their mother again, her laughter trailing behind her. Jalen exhaled, watching her go, the sound of her joy easing the ache in his chest. Maybe it wasn't a perfect ending. Maybe there would never be a perfect ending in a world where battles like this were fought every day. But Aaliyah was happy, her wrist sparkling with the bracelet he'd chosen, her birthday filled with the love he'd wanted to give her. For now, that was enough. He leaned back on the couch, his phone still in his hand, the news articles forgotten. Simone stepped into the room, her suit jacket off, her hair pulled back, looking more like his mom than the chief of police. She sat beside him, her presence warm, grounding. "You did good, baby," she said quietly, her voice carrying a pride that made his throat tighten. Jalen shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You did," he said, meeting her gaze. "I just stood there." Simone reached out, squeezing his hand, her eyes fierce and soft all at once. "You stood tall," she said, her voice firm. "And that's more than enough." Jalen nodded, the weight of her words settling over him, a quiet strength he hadn't realized he needed. The battle wasn't over. It never would be. But in this moment, with his sister's laughter echoing from the kitchen, his mother's hand in his, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were winning one fight at a time. Thank you for joining us on the Jones Life Stories. This story is a testament to the power of standing up, speaking out, and refusing to let the world define you. If Jalen's courage inspired you, hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the Jones Life Stories with the notification bell on to start your day with more profound lessons and heartfelt empathy. Keep fighting for what's right, keep shining your light, and never let anyone dim your truth. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and stay inspired.